Hello everyone, both of you. This is a video about the modifications to the motor of a 1974 MZ TS250 4-speed for drag racing. Now, the MZ TS250, if you are not familiar with it, which chances are you're not, is an East German motorcycle that is rather agricultural in purpose, I suppose would be the polite way of putting it. It is strictly for transportation. It was designed for the common man to use to get around East Germany. They are simple, cheap, and made to be easily repaired by somebody with limited resources. So, they are also not particularly fast. So in order to make this thing go fast, we had to do some extensive changes to the cylinder head, the exhaust, and the transmission. So let's take a look at the cylinder head modifications. Here is an original TS250 cylinder. Now the bore, I believe, is something like 60, let's see, it usually says here on the cylinder. This is the original piston, 68 millimeter bore. So this is the piston that came with it. And as you can see inside, you have some rather conservatively sized intake ports and exhaust ports. This was designed for a peak power RPM of in the 6,000 range. So it wasn't made to be a super high-speed go-fast bike. Two-strokes, if you know anything about two-stroke racing, you know that those engines back in the day, they would run at 22,000 RPM, which is, that's a lot. So anyway, and here's the intake tract of the original bike. It's rather long, and it was made to get the carburetor off to one side, because intakes on a two-stroke have to be rather low, you know, relative to the cylinder head, as your four-strokes come in through the head, through the valves. The intake on a two-stroke is near the bottom, sometimes with a crankcase in the case of a disc valve induction type. So that is our factory head. Here is our modified one, which, as you can see, has been bored out to be much larger. You can see the difference in the exhaust port. Much, much wider than our factory cylinder. New, oh, look at that little bitty. And in order to achieve our RPM range of preference, the port ceiling was lowered, and so was the floor, and the port was made a little wider. They were polished and cleaned. The gentleman who did this is a two-stroke tuning master, and he's been doing this for longer than I've been alive, and really knows his onions. You know, if anyone can make this thing into a fast bike, it's going to be him. But you can see the bore took away a lot of the meat of the iron liner. You see how thin this is now. That's probably a little under 2 millimeters, if probably less than that. It's probably like 1¼ millimeters. That's tiny. Look at the original one. Look how thick that is. Look at that. So, and of course the piston is different too. This is, I believe, a piston that is originally intended for a jet ski. It is much shorter, only has 2 rings instead of 3, flatter at the top, and as you can see, is a little bit lighter in spite of being a much larger bore. The bore on this brought the displacement up from 243 cc's to 302 cc's, if I'm not mistaken. So already we're getting more cubes out of this thing. So, oh yeah, of course the old MZ piston is, you know, to quote another MZ enthusiast, made of spat up cardboard, and it is useless for racing. It is too heavy. It is probably not forged, definitely not forged, and it's 3 rings, very draggy. It's made to last a long time, not to go fast. So this piston actually fits the original gudgeon pin and a conrod, and certain things had to be taken into consideration when selecting this piston, because we had to widen our exhaust port so much. You have to make sure that these pins, among other things, are not anywhere near that exhaust port, otherwise the break in the ring will enter the exhaust port and snag and shatter. So that was one of the bugaboos we had in finding a piston, was finding one where the locator pins would not foul into the exhaust port. This one is just perfect for that. Some pistons also had little oiler holes in them that made them unusable because they would get in the exhaust port too and then cause all kinds of leaks and God knows what else. You know, you could like tap in there and fill it and blah, 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 but who wants to take a risk like that? So that's our cylinder. And we've done away with the super long intake tract and gone to a little spigot, which puts our new carburetor here in Mikuni TMX style right up against it, as opposed to really far away from it. That required some crankcase modifications, which we will get to in a moment. So that is our cylinders. And basically that, oh yeah, also the top was decked. He took off an entire set of fins down to the circle to get the compression right, because as you can see, this piston is a lot taller relative to the gudgeon pinhole. So we had to deck approximately that much off the top to get our cylinder head in the right place. All right, so that are our cylinder heads. Let's take a look at, oh, that's our cylinder, not the head. The head is next. This is the new cylinder head. It is a block of aluminum with a nice squish chamber, O-ring head. This was completely custom fabricated. The original head was this big finned monstrosity. The thing is about this tall. I'll point the camera at it later on. You can see what it looks like, but yeah, much, much bigger. And the spark plug comes in at a sharp angle into a little teeny squish dome. And, well, it's easy to access and change and check and blah, blah, blah. It also is not the optimum position for a spark plug when you want to be racing. So this was, again, totally custom manufactured. And with the MZ, the motor mount is actually attached to the cylinder head, the upper mount. There's a mount here, and then there's mounts at the back of the crankcase. So this engine actually hangs from the center frame member. There's no front frame. There's no frame in front of the engine on this bike. So this, he had to also fabricate motor mounts. This is the actual rubber mount. There's a big pin that goes through here, and this is rubber bushing. So when the thing vibrates, which when you see the actual factory bike running, a lot of vibration in that motor. It's a big thumper. So when it revs up, it smooths out nicely. When you're idling, the thing isn't timed right. The bike will dance across the garage floor if you let it sit. So that is that. Now, onto our crankcase mods. This is your TS250 crankcase. Not a whole lot was modified with this. All that was done was to better match these ports with the corresponding openings in the cylinder head here, because you want that to be relatively smooth. The intake can handle a little turbulence because it helps to mix the fuel and air a little better. When you really want to polish things, you want to polish the exhaust side, because that's what you want to be smooth to avoid buildup of crud and carbonants, what have you. Now, because we slammed the carburetor right up here against the cylinder head, we found out why MZ put it all the way on the outside. Because the bottom of pretty much any carburetor sink into the crankcase. So, actually this goes like this. Anyway, so what was done here was this was cut out, which sacrificed our oil inlet, actually. So I'm going to have to drill a little hole in here to put crankcase oil, or gearbox oil in here. When we use it for drag racing, but it's just for drag racing, so, you know, no big deal. It's not like I'm riding this thing down the street or to work or anything, but this had to be cut out, dished, and welded in to let that carburetor fit down there right against the back of that cylinder. So this carburetor's been power jetted, and it's a nice little TMX flat slide. Should be more than adequate for this little machine. My street MZ 250 that I have over in the corner of the garage behind me, I've actually got a Mikuni VM30, but it's a little bit bigger than the factory carb, but it runs the bike just fabulous. So you can't really go wrong with a good Mikuni, if you ask me. So that's really all the mods we did to the crankcase. There's not a whole lot else that was done here. See, this is a nice, see how old school this design is. It's a vertically split crankcase, and normally to get these things apart, you have to fabricate special tools that MZ actually gives you the schematics for in the back of their user manual. I built a couple out of gas pipe and flanges, but you have to very carefully press these apart and have them heated because the bearings are all press fit. This isn't like a Honda motor, you can just take it apart. This thing you have to, like, yeah, I know I said it was meant to be repaired easily by the side of the road, but I'm talking things that aren't involving splitting the crankcase. Getting this thing apart, yeah, it's very precision, and everything is a really tight squeeze fit. So, yeah, that's why they last so long, because everything is nice and very precisely fit together. So, now we're going to go to the crank shaft itself. Not a whole lot of modifications to this. All we did was weld the end pins and make sure it was true and balanced and blah, blah, blah. A guy also skimmed down the outside of these bearings so they slide out now. They're no longer a slip fit, no longer a press fit. I don't have to use the tools to get the damn thing apart anymore. You may see these huge spaces. One weird thing MC did on these bikes is put the crankcase seals in between the bearings and the crankshaft. So replacing the crank seals in this thing requires splitting the entire engine. Subsequent models, MZ put the seals on the outside so they can actually be replaced without taking the whole engine apart. But on the early TS250s, that's the way they work. And you need to use a puller to get these off. And curiously enough, which some people have noticed when taking these bikes apart, the oil seals in the crankcase are facing backwards to what you would traditionally see them facing. The springs usually face the oil. On this bike, the springs face the outside. And that, my hypothesis for the reasoning behind that is that when you have, they're more likely to leak towards the springs from the outside, not from the spring side, but from the outside face. That's how the old seals work. They were made to hold compression in from the spring side. So a leak into the crankcase is far more damaging than a leak of air going outside the crankcase. So MZ put the seals the opposite direction to have the performance robbing thing be more likely to occur than to have the engine destroying leak of fresh air being sucked into the crankcase. If you suck fresh air into a two-stroke crankcase past the carburetor, you get what is called a catastrophically lean condition, which will destroy a piston. It may not destroy the motor, it will definitely mess with the piston. For example, here I have the original piston from my TS250. After I restored it, I did not adequately seal the intake tract. So look at the intake tract, it has these little slots and pinch bolts. Well, these slots were leaking after I retrofitted the Mikuni carburetor. They were sucking in fresh air just past the carburetor. Well, I rode the bike up and down the street a distance of maybe a mile and a half. By the time I got back, it would not shut off because it was what we call dieseling, which is when the engine is so hot that the spark plug is glowing and it just keeps running even if you shut the ignition off. It doesn't need a spark, it's got a red hot spark plug tip. So that was happening. I had to stall the bike. And if you look closely here, you can hardly tell from here, but this piston, the face is scuffed, the edge had begun to melt, and look under here. You can't really see it that well, but in here was a bunch of ash. And yeah, the whole thing was like starting to heat up so much that you began to get fuel burning and turning into carbon underneath the piston, which means it was really, really, really hot. And then another mile, I would have had a hole in this thing. So it's a good thing I pulled my driver when I did. So that is the modifications to the crankshaft. Not a whole lot. And the final and probably most radical modification to this thing is the transmission gears. Here's our transmission pack, or whatever you want to call it. Now, in the standard setup, there's a fourth gear that is basically an overdrive. It's a 4-speed. Now, the bike feels like it's a 5-speed missing fourth gears. When you go into fourth gear, the thing just becomes a sluggish, totally no torque kind of thing. You better be already going 50 miles an hour downhill when you go into fourth. So that gear, for drag racing, that kind of jumping ratio is really, really bad because you're going to drop out of your power band pretty quickly and you won't have any torque to continue going. So what we did was switched, this is fourth gear right here, drive and driven gear. What we did was I gave him an extra gear of each. He hollowed out the inside of one and took the outside of the other, and we actually flip-flopped the 2 gears because it was an overdrive. So this puts fourth gear at a slight underdrive, which will increase the torque and lessen the likelihood of dropping out of the power band. I do not know if this has ever been done before on one of these bikes. They were hollowed out, ground off, press fit together, welded, and hardened steel pins were driven at an angle into these from the outside to the inside, because you had a hollow out slug with the outside popping on the inside. So because this one is fixed to the shaft and this one is a freewheeler, so we had to reverse them. So this has not been tested yet on the track. We do not know if it's going to work or how much it's really going to help. But it definitely has to help some, because you couldn't get any worse than that fourth gear on an MZ TS250. You guys who've ridden one will know exactly what I'm talking about. But I still have to have these heat treated. He's really adamant about getting that done because he wants to make sure this works, and me too, honestly. I can't see it not working. It's fourth gear. You're not like doing a whole shot in fourth gear. That's your last hurrah before the finish line, hopefully. So yeah, this is just a go fast bike. It's not made to run around the track for hours and hours. Hence the solid aluminum cylinder head that's no good at all for cooling. But a lot of guys who drag race two strokes will do that, because you go to the end of the track, you shut your motor off. That's it. There's no time for it to overheat. It just gets down the track as fast as you can and then shut down. If I were to ride something like that around the street with a cylinder head like that, I think it would overheat in about 5 minutes. But you're not running the bike for 5 minutes. You're running the bike for less than a minute. So that is the bulk of the modifications to the engine. The exact math behind the porting is a lot of that stuff. There's guys who will give you formulas to use. There's guys who have rules of thumb, and there's guys who just wing it. But there's a lot of careful thought put into this. Without having the car correspondence in front of me, I couldn't tell you exactly the measurements of the height that was raised and lowered, the surface area that was increased in the openings, and what the reasoning was behind that, or what rules of thumb or standards were used. And in any case, it'd probably be useless to tell you anyway, because if you're into this at all, you probably have your own ideas about how to do things, and that's great. So I'm not afraid of anybody copying me and trying to beat me. I'm in the U.S. There's I don't know how many MZs left in the U.S., but I don't think there's any that are going to be on the drag strip. I can tell you that right now. So other than that, that's the modifications we've done so far. And the bike itself is behind me here, kind of on the rack. That's a dummy motor I bought. Here's the original cylinder head I was telling you about that spark plug going on the side. And here's the motor mount, the lower mount. And here's the expansion chamber pipe that I cobbled together from some sheet metal using very specific instructions from Howard Richards, my engine builder. And he designed it, and I fabricated the tools to make it, which you can see in some of my other videos. Here's our points cover. Here's the original crankcase. You see what had to be hogged out there for that carburetor to fit on the other one. Here's the oil inlet thing I told you about that had to be sacrificed in order to make that carburetor fit. And see the bike in its entirety. It's got an original tank, original front end, completely original frame, aftermarket seat. I'm going to have an aluminum swing arm fabricated, and I may just go with struts. I'm not sure if I should use springs or struts, but we'll see what happens when we do a test and tune. So that's about it. And yeah, there's an airplane sitting on the back of the seat. I don't know. It's just like too many hobbies. So anyway, that's the old girl. A lot of these parts on this bike were taken from an MZ that was wrecked with 17 miles on it, including the engine. The engine I used for this was practically brand new. It only been run for a few minutes, long enough to go 17 miles, and then something horrible happened to it, and I found the guy who had all the parts, and I bought them. And the frame actually came right from Germany. This frame has never been built into a bike. Here's the number tag. When I got it, it still had the bolts in here that they used in the paint booth. It had layers and layers and layers of MZ paint on it from painting many, many frames throughout the years. I've got them hanging in my display case. So, piece of history right there. And I had to make these side panels. I can't find new side panels to save my life. These are just pieces of aluminum with an MZ logo glued on, or screwed on rather. So anyway, and there's a little red thing in the corner next to the Suzuki. That's my grandfather's original MZ. He bought it brand new, 1974, and it was the first motorcycle I ever rode on. 1983 or 84, I went for a ride around the yard on that bike, and I still ride it all the time in the summer. Anyway, thanks for watching, and stay tuned.